people, we see health in a holistic way. It is not just the body that we focus on, but rather the whole being. The heart, the spirit, the mind are all equally important in our ways of knowing and being. Our connection to all creation helps us to know that we are part of an intricate system on this planet. Our connection to all creation helps us to know that we are all, I just said that, sorry, I told you. Excuse me, I said it twice because I love it. I'm just kidding. As we open space today, let us take a moment and to connect to holiness, to see that we are made up of much more than we might be able to see. Take a minute, place your hand on your heart, and take a deep breath, and your day will be awesome. Kichi Manitou, who's a great creator, we welcome you into this sacred space. Touch this space with your light and protection. Help us gather in a good way. Help us to remember our interconnectedness and the teachings that the land offers us today on a daily basis. We welcome all the aspects of creation to support us today: the soil, the stars, the water, the plants, and the animals. May we walk in right relation with the earth and all our relations. I welcome each and every one of you into this brilliant conference, and may it serve you to continue to walk with respect and love. But that I say, miigwech, thank you, and have a beautiful conference. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Larry, for these welcoming words. And it's really good to think about not only the things that you mentioned, but how we connect to nature in particular in these days. So thank you so much for welcoming us. We have a welcoming video message from John Tory, the mayor of Toronto, who couldn't be here today, but at least provides a video message. I think that's part of our new way of working. So if we could play that, that would be wonderful.
Hello, Toronto Mayor John Tory here, and it's a pleasure to extend greetings as you gather for the GIN 17th Annual Conference. Founded in 2002, the Guidelines International Network, or GIN, has grown to become a global network that is leading and strengthening and supporting collaboration and work within the guideline development, adaptation, and implementation community. As you all know, there is increased need for greater cooperation in medical research, and that's why I'm so pleased that you work together to do just that. And I must say your membership and your reach is quite remarkable. 111 organizational members, 240 members, individual members from 61 countries, all with a common goal of improving healthcare. Now, I understand that this conference was scheduled to be hosted in Toronto, like many others, in 2020. But of course, it ended up being canceled in response to the pandemic. So I'm very pleased that you're able to enjoy the conference in our great city this year. The conference is such a valuable opportunity for all of those who work with guidelines in health and social care to come together, from development and methodology through to implementation and evaluation. I hope that while you're here in Toronto, you enjoy all that our city has to offer, taking advantage of the restaurants, the entertainment, the culture, and I hope that while you're at it, you might drop $1 or $2 and do some shopping. I wish you continued success both at this conference and with your important work in the years ahead. Thank you very much.
No, we are hugely appreciative of Mayor Tory sending this message, actually, because as you can tell, he also did his homework about GIN, and that's great. And the City of Toronto has really been extremely, I think, collaborative. The City of Toronto extremely collaborative in setting up this conference, and it is a beautiful place. We've arranged for some not so high temperatures over the next couple days. That way the outside is not as attractive as it would be if you had sunshine, because we want you here in this room and in the other rooms, as you well know. But if you stay on for the weekend, it's going to get better again. So we work a little bit. On the weekend, you get to enjoy the good weather. I would like to hand over to Zach Munn, the chair of GIN, and to continue with the program. Zach, great to have you here.
Wonderful. How do I get... here we go. We've already talked about the conference scene, but firstly, welcome everybody. It is just amazing to see all of your faces actually in person instead of behind a box on a screen. I was just saying it's quite different actually speaking up and speaking to people live in person. We're all a little bit out of practice, but there is going to be a fantastic program over the next few days with many speakers from across the globe who'll be able to try and test those skills again to actually speak and talk in person. So our theme, which Holger has already introduced to you all, it was decided seems like many years ago, making health choices transparent, equitable and efficient, strengthening global guideline quality, technology, collaboration and adaptation. And as Holger's pointed out, this is just as important as ever, even coming out of a pandemic. So I think we're going to have a fantastic 2.5 days. I know a lot of work has been put into the program, so really looking forward to spending the time with you over the next 2.5 days. Okay, so this is actually our 17th annual conference. We have here, in person, we have 413 people who have come here. And I think that is remarkable. It's the first time we've gathered in person since 2019. And to see everyone come back to the GIN conference is just fantastic. And it has been an uncertain time. So thank you to you all for coming and supporting us at GIN and coming along to make this conference what we hope to be a great success. Now, you're coming from over 40 countries as well, with a lot of people from North America, but also a lot of people who have travelled a long way. So thank you all for taking the time to actually come back and join us here over the next few days. Now, for some of you, this may actually be your first GIN conference, and it's my pleasure to actually just go over what we do as an organisation and to state our vision and our mission. Although I feel like Mayor Tory kind of did this already, in fact, probably a lot more eloquently than I can. But our vision is trustworthy and accessible guidance for better health. And our mission is to lead, strengthen and support collaboration and work within a guideline development, adaptation and implementation community. So as Mayor Tory has already said, what we want to do is facilitate networking and collaboration, both nationally and internationally, in the field of guideline development. And we want to support continuous learning. And as such, one of our flagship events and programs is this conference. And once again, it's fantastic to see you all here. Now, we were established in 2002, so it's actually an extra special conference this year because it is our 20th anniversary. And I hope some of you may have got your little badges, which will be, some of us will be wearing with pride. There's different colours. I picked a teal one. I hope it looks nice and accessorised as well, but you can all choose your own colours as well. But it is our 20th anniversary, so it is an extra special event. And I just wanted to highlight as well that the reason, well, what we are the Guidelines International Network, and it is all about networking and building these connections, and that's why we felt it was so important to have this in-person event, even though there are obviously a number of risks associated with that during this time. So once again, thank you for coming. But really, I would encourage you all to make sure you do meet, form new connections over the next few days. I've been coming to GIN conferences for a long time, and I can say that people who come here are very warm, friendly, and welcoming. So please do go make connections. Head along to the working group and regional community meetings, meet people, form new friendships, and have a lot of fun. Really make the most of it. Now, I do need to also thank our sponsors, because without them, we wouldn't be able to hold these types of events. So I would like to thank our gold sponsor this year, which is EBSCO. And EBSCO are committed to providing healthcare professionals with evidence-based information when, where and how they need it through clinical decision support, shared decision-making and competency development solutions to support high-quality patient care. And I would encourage you all to also go and visit our exhibitors as well and have a listen to the products that they are offering, and how they might be able to help you in guideline development. And I'd like to thank all of our sponsors as well. Now, one thing I would like to do, I don't have a slide on it, but I would also like to extend my thanks to the local host, and particularly Holger and the team at McMaster. As Holger said, this has probably been the longest conference we've ever planned. It's been about 4 years, I think, since the first proposal came in to actually host this event in Toronto. And the scientific committee has been operating as well for, I think, about 4 years, which would probably be the longest scientific committee for a conference just about ever. I think someone mentioned in the AGM yesterday, it's like a living scientific committee because they've had to make so many different choices and decisions along the way. But along with being the local host, and Holger is also the vice chair of GIN and also co-leading the scientific committee with Miloslav. So it's been a huge amount of work for Holger and the McMaster team. And I think, once again, to actually get us here in Toronto, I think deserves a round of applause. So thank you again, Holger and the team. Now, it's with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce the Naja Milka Kabane Award, which is the annual award that we offer at GIN. This award was established in memory of Naja Milka Kabane, who was a former head of guidelines development and a trustee of the Hoti Aturat Desante. My French is terrible. I need to spend more time in Canada, perhaps. Trustee of GIN board from 2003 to 2010 and an honorary GIN patron. Najwa passed away in 2011, and this award acknowledges an individual's outstanding efforts, so someone from the GIN community, an individual's outstanding efforts on innovation of methodology, development and or implementation of clinical practice guidelines. And we offer this award every year, and there's a committee who actually look through all of the applications and then decide on who is going to be the successful recipient of this award. And the chair of the committee for the past year was Karina Schaefer. And Karina, I'd like to introduce you to announce the award.
Yes, that was a very nice task we had in the past few years. I have the honor of chairing this committee, and the good thing is you know that in the end of your process you always have a winner, and you have a very nice task to offer an award to someone who really deserves it. Last year, I must say, we had very strong candidates, and the colleagues on this committee, I think most of them are in the room right here, so thank you all for your work that you did. We had very strong candidates, and it was a difficult choice, but however, the committee was certain about the winner. And I'm very, very happy to offer this year's award to Romina Brynjadello-Petersen. And as you can see on the slide, and we definitely mean this, for her outstanding work and very strong contribution to the GRADE methodology, for developing an approach how to make sensible use of network meta-analyses. And that was really important for us because as guideline developers, you know that this is a definitely challenging task, how to deal with network meta-analysis and how to make sense of that, what they bring up as results. So please come up, Romina, and I'll hand you over a certificate today. The reward you'll get at a later point because it's very beautiful, it looks very nice. However, this is your floor. Thank you so much for your work.
Thanks. I'm very happy to be here, very thankful. And I'd like to acknowledge the three main groups that made it possible for me to be here. When I first moved in 2010, my first opportunity to work in guidelines was given to me by the MacRate Center, and specifically by Holger and the group. So that sparked my interest very early in guidelines and how to make them useful, and how to make evidence synthesis that support guidelines useful. So thank you so much to Holger and the MacRate Center and everyone who works there. The second group with whom I've worked closely in guidelines is also here somewhere in the room. I'm not sure, but it's the MAGIC group based in Norway. They've also provided many opportunities for me to work in guidelines, so thank you so much to them. And finally, Gord Gayed, who's not here today, but he's also been one of my mentors over the years and has helped me and provided guidance. So thanks to everyone who's been part of the things that I've done. I'm very grateful for all the collaborations throughout the years and looking forward to connecting with more people and continue working. Thank you.
Fantastic. And now I would like to introduce the CEO of GIN, Elaine. Elaine, would you like to come up?
Thank you, Zach. Well, welcome back, everybody. It is absolutely amazing to see so many of you back together. As has been said already, this is a conference that we've been so nervous about, even up until the last minute. Would it happen? Would something cause it not to happen? We just never imagined when we were in Adelaide in 2019 that a global pandemic would prevent us from physically meeting again until now. So it is really wonderful to see so many of you back in the room, and welcome to new people as well. On the topic of COVID, I would just like to say please be sensitive to fellow delegates, and remember that not everyone wants to hug, shake hands, just be sensitive to that. Although last night at the welcome reception, if that was anything to go by, there's a lot of huggers in this room. As Zach mentioned, we are celebrating the 20 years of GIN this year, and I think everybody's catching on to this quite quickly with our badges and our logos. But as we approach the 20-year anniversary, I'm just thrilled to be able to be part of it and to launch that here in Toronto. We are slightly premature. We're not quite 20 just yet, but this was just way too good an opportunity to miss. We wanted to mark the occasion by producing a 20-year timeline on our website, which we have done. This has been developed over the past few months to show our key achievements and what GIN is all about and what we've done over the 20 years since we were founded. So, tiny bit about us. We were founded in November 2002. There was a founding chair who is Günther Rollenschläger from AZQ in Germany. And we have Karina here today representing the organisation, so we're delighted to have you here. Yeah, sadly we don't have Günther here, or Catherine Marshall, who was the vice chair of the founding committee. Catherine at that time was with the New Zealand Guidelines Group. We had an international founding committee with 21 people. Two of whom should have been in our midst, but we have one of them here. And that is Jakob Burgers, who has already been hosting a meeting this morning, multimorbidity. So great to have you here. We hope that we might have a second one before the time is off, before the time is out, and that's Thius van Barneveld, but he has been detained in a quarantine hotel at this point in time. An unfortunate sign of the times. Our 20-year timeline, which is now live on our website, goes through each individual year, as you can see on the screen, with the highlights, and then you can click through and find out a little bit more about what happened each year. And I would really encourage you all to have a look at it. It really is very interesting when you see where we've come to, what's happened over the years to get us to where we are now. Finally, I would just like to highlight the working group and regional community meetings that are happening. They are happening early in the morning. I know that Anna Gagliardi was hosting implementation at 7 AM this morning, and Jaco was hosting multimorbidity. They will continue. There will be some at lunchtime. They're all in the meeting schedule. everybody is welcome to attend these meetings. So even although it's something you've not been involved in up until now, every single delegate is totally welcome. Go and find out about topics that you're interested in and take part in them. It's a great way to get to know like-minded people and to find out a bit more about the topics that we're working on. So with that, I would like to hand over to Holger and Miloslav, the chair and vice chair of our scientific committee, and say, before I hand over to them, a huge thanks. You cannot imagine the work that has gone in this year. Many of you will have served on scientific committees over the years, and there's processes that you go through. This year, because of COVID, because of visas, because of all sorts of travel issues, they have been working until the very last minute, and I'm immensely grateful to them and the whole scientific committee. It has been a mammoth task, but I think you're going to find that they've done it incredibly well. So thank you very much, and I will hand back over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I have to say it's absolutely vibrant to see the full hall of our delegates, and it's just something amazing, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of our living scientific committee, we can say, because it was beautiful 4 years we spent together, chairing with Professor Holger Schönemann and vice chairing with me. And we had excellent colleagues who were all the time with us on all meetings. So it's also great thank you to our colleagues Eddie Lang, Yanong Chen, Tamara Credo, Marcus Holman, Christine Lane, Rodrigo Pardo Turiago, Zach Mann, Nancy Santezo, Howard White, and John Groh. So thank you very much. For us, as you see, it was nice work because we received 386 abstracts, so quite a bit work for a scientific committee and abstract reviewing committee, so thank you very much for all colleagues who were reviewing the abstracts. And I have to say that almost all abstracts were very good, so it was quite tough task to pick the best ones for you to make the conference very interesting and diverse, and I hope we manage this, and those who were excluded in the end were those who were not registered or they couldn't make it here, so that's the reason why you see a little bit bigger number there. So overall we have 112 oral presentations, 10 panel sessions, 10 workshops, and 118 poster presentations. Well, the plenary, I think those we are proud in a scientific committee that we were able to secure for us, I would say, excellent and diverse speakers for our plenaries, which you can see actually on a slide. And for the first one is Equity and Guidelines, Sir Michael Marmot, Vivian Welsh, Shelley Deeks, who will quite soon start here. Then the second plenary, Efficiency and Guideline Development, with Nicola Magrini, Radim Líčeník, Jung Xia, Lisa Askey. The third plenary will be about visualizational information and recommendations with Malavika Tampi, Tamar Al-Lutfi, and Amir Kasim. Plenary fourth, Guidelines Without Borders, Developing Recommendations with Mark Reynup, Lorian Morrison, Carla Soares-Weiser. And the last plenary will be about a choice or decisions, transparency, André Picard, Izio Trava de Santos Filo, and Nancy Santezo. And before we start with the first plenary session, here is a small reminder. So all important information you will find on the conference app, all abstracts, all important information. So hopefully all of you have the conference app on already and you prepared your personal program in it. Then of course, here is the hashtag, which you please use, and use the social media and share the experiences you have here within our, I hope, excellent and vibrant conference. So thank you all for coming, and I think we can start, and I will hand the word to Professor Holger Schillemann and Dr. Tamara Credo for the first plenary session. Thank you.
So as we transition to our first plenary, I'd like to introduce Tamara Credo, Dr. Tamara Credo. So Tamara is actually I'm extremely pleased to be able to chair this first session with Tamara because we've worked together for quite some time. And it's it's an enormous privilege that you were able to make this long way here. So Tamara is a public health doc from Cape Town, South Africa, has many roles and made huge contributions to guidelines and evidence synthesis, including working with the Cochrane collaboration and obviously with GIN for many years. And Tamara and I will chair this session together. I'm obviously also extremely pleased to welcome our speakers for the first. We're still sorting out the arrangements here. That's good because people may be wondering, we have Sir Michael Marmot on the program, and why is he not here? We have we will have over the course of the next few days 2 remote sessions for good reasons. One of them was that Sir Michael Marmot has, in view of the pandemic, decided to not travel for meetings anymore for many reasons, but we were extremely keen to have him for this important topic, equity and guidelines, with his role on the determinants of health. Anyways, we will have a second session for visa issues, but that will all be described in more detail. As I hand over to Tamara to introduce our first speaker. Welcome, Tamara.
Hi everyone. It is really great to see everyone here. Thanks, Holger. And of course, I should just introduce Holger for those, I think everyone would know Holger, but obviously Holger is a leading clinician scientist at McMaster University, a clinical epidemiologist, a guideline methodologist, and I think embodies so much around evidence-based healthcare in his leadership and his mentorship, and I think you can read more about it if you Google. So I think just to start off the session, I'm going to invite Dr. Shelley Deeks to come up shortly. But just to say thank you for making time to join us today. So Dr. Deeks is really a leading light in the immunization field, working with national advisory groups, but also with WHO SAGE and the polio working group, amongst other leadership roles. She's also Deputy Chief Medical Officer of Health for the province of Nova Scotia in Canada and Associate Professor at Dalalana School of Public Health. So we're delighted to have you here speaking to us as a public health leader, and I'll invite you up. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. As was mentioned, my name is Shelley Deeks, and I am the chair of Canada's National Advisory Committee on Immunization. That's Canada's NITAG. For those of you not in Canada, it's similar to ACIP in the US, JCVI in the UK, STIKO in Germany, and Canada we're called NACI. So I'm going to be focusing on equity. And I think this pandemic has demonstrated that infectious diseases can exacerbate many health inequities, and vaccine programs can help to address it, but only if implemented equitably. So are vaccines the great equalizer? I'm going to be talking today about vaccine programs in Canada and specifically about NACI and how we use our frameworks to address equity. But I thought I should start with identifying our approach in Canada to vaccine programs. So Health Canada is our regulator. Health Canada authorized vaccines. NACI makes recommendations on vaccine use in Canada for individuals and for public health. The provinces and territories respond to the NACI recommendations and make the decisions regarding inclusion of a vaccine in their publicly funded program. The provincial and territorial decisions are also complex. Vaccines are expensive, and they're often not transparent for the public. In Canada, unlike a country like Australia, we don't have a national immunization program. So we have 13 provinces and territories and 13 programs, which can cause controversy. I've got a highlight here from Quebec, noting that Quebec children deserve the same cancer protection as the rest of Canada, and that came out when the HPV vaccine program was different in Quebec compared to the rest of Canada. So we're one country, we have one recommendation, but we have 13 immunization programs, and of course that can be a cause for concern and is not equitable. This is just an example that it doesn't just affect children, so you can see 5 programs there. Most notably zoster vaccine, which NACI recommended in probably about 2016 be universally funded, and you can see that only 2 provinces in Canada have funded zoster vaccine publicly. So in terms of NACI, I'm just going to give you a bit of our history, and then I will go through the equity example. So we're one of the oldest NITAGs in the world. We were established more than 50 years ago. We're a volunteer external advisory body to the Public Health Agency of Canada, and we provide recommendations relating to vaccine use in humans. We meet all the requirements and performance indicators set out by the WHO for national immunization technical advisory groups. And in 2016, we expanded our mandate to include programmatic factors such as equity, ethics, feasibility, acceptability, and cost-effective. This is just a pictorial about regarding the process and who does what. It's quite complex in Canada, as it is in many countries. So you can see this is a pictorial of our considerations, what we consider when we're making recommendations. The orange circles on your left are the traditional elements that we consider, that we've always considered for the past 50 years, which is burden of disease, vaccine efficacy, effectiveness, immunogenicity, and safety. However, as I said, in 2016, we expanded our mandate to include acceptability, feasibility, economics, equity, and ethics. And that has been a tremendous expansion. We now have our recommendations that are kind of dual focused. We provide public health recommendations, so those are really directed at the provinces to determine to assist them in determining what should be included in their publicly funded programs. But we also have individual recommendations that are targeted at the individual clinician to assist them with communicating with their patients if something isn't publicly funded, and to assist them with making recommendations to their individual patients. So as I said, in 2016, we expanded our considerations, and we've taken a systematic approach to this. I'm going to be focused on equity, but you can see we have matrices that assist us with ethics, feasibility, and acceptability. We also have a systematic process for health economics as well. So in terms of equity and immunization programs, we systematically and transparently I think is important here, work through the spectrum of public health considerations to hopefully reduce inequities and improve access. So some of the considerations are whether the program is equitable in terms of access of the vaccine for all of the targeted populations. So the framework we used is a published framework. It was informed by the Progress Plus model of health determinants and outcomes introduced by Evans and Brown in 2003 and endorsed by the Cochrane Equity Methods, a group for equity-focused systematic reviews. We consider the expanded categories for those captured in Progress Plus. So we include place of residence, race, ethnicity, culture, language, immigrant or refugee status, occupation, gender identity and sex, religion, belief systems, literacy level, SES, and social capital. For immunization programs, though, we've also expanded it, and we include pre-existing conditions, age, and other factors such as risk behaviors, so smoking, substance use, etc. So we term our equity matrix progress and other factors. And this is an example of what we systematically go through. It's really the team at the Public Health Agency systematically go through to identify the potential inequities and looking at, in the third column, interventions to potentially reduce inequities. And importantly, when we look through each of the categories, there is identification of intersecting inequities, because of course we know these are not unique. For example, a group that has a racialized group may also have distinct occupations that put them at risk, may also live in places that are at increased risk for infectious diseases. So now I'm going to focus on COVID. And in Canada, as I'm sure in all of the countries here, our immunization programs were really heavily scrutinized, and these are some of the highlights in coverage over the years. I just thought it would be important to place COVID and NACI in perspective for you. So typically NACI met, we were kind of an obscure committee that those in immunization knew about, but the rest of Canada didn't. And of course, COVID brought us to the forefront. Everybody knows about NACI now in Canada. Previously we met 3 times a year. This shows the number of meetings. In 2021 alone, we had 55 meetings. We had 31 publications. And to note that this is a volunteer committee, and most of us actually had real jobs that we were working and quite busy during the pandemic. So it's been an interesting time. In terms of our application of health equity to vaccines, we all know that COVID has magnified inequities. And as I said originally, vaccine programs have the potential to exacerbate, and we've seen this around the globe, inequities. And our equity framework shed light on the full spectrum of health inequities and the sources and intersection of them. And it can be used for equitable decision making. We've published a roadmap here. Now I know this is too small print for you to see, but it's an example of the equity matrix as used for COVID. And we looked at every single grouping of the matrix and identified how COVID impacted the risk groups, identified intersecting risk factors, and potential strategies. We developed, one of the first things we developed was a prioritization framework. This was developed, you can see, the first time in 2020, in November 2020, so that was before vaccines were actually licensed in Canada. This has evolved a bit over the course of the pandemic, and although it seems like a no-brainer now, Taking us back to December and January as the vaccines rolled out, identifying racialized populations as a risk group was actually quite controversial at the time. And focusing on equity as opposed to equality was also quite controversial. And we received quite a bit of negative press for doing that. This is a snapshot, just so that you can see them, of the COVID-19 inequities identified by the framework. You'll note some are in gray, and those are the ones that weren't grounded in the literature, but that we felt were reasonable to assume. And of course, as everybody's aware, even our evidence on who is at risk for a specific disease is biased, because not all groups are actually researched. So that's why we included the gray groups. This was updated throughout, and we included it in our deliberations about who should be receiving vaccines. This is just an excerpt from one of our statements. I just wanted to show it to you so you could see how it was used when we developed guidelines for who should be eligible for the spring booster. One of the groups at risk was, and I just highlight the first bullet, those at risk of severe illness and death. So it's your traditional groups, old age, underlying medical conditions, but the third group is populations who have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic due to a number of intersecting equity factors. So again, that theme is fundamental in our recommendations and run throughout the recommendations for COVID vaccines. This is our most recent recommendations for fall booster dose. And again, I'll highlight group 4, which was adults or in or from First Nation, Métis, or Inuit communities, where infection can have disproportional consequences, adults in racialized communities and or marginalized communities, so people living with disabilities as an example, who can be disproportionately affected by COVID-19. So again, the theme of equity driving recommendations is carried throughout our recommendations. Now, one of the most controversial things in Canada was our extended intervals, particularly being beside our country to the south, the US, where they kept very strict to the product, the way the product was authorized. In Canada, we decided initially we went with the product authorization for intervals, and then we decided that it was important to think about equity and made the decision, similar to a decision in the UK, to recommend an extended interval between the first and the second dose. And this is when supply was a real challenge in early 2021. And we recommended up to a 4-month interval. That was extremely controversial in Canada. We got a lot of grief. This almost gave me PTSD putting this slide in, but this was some of the reactions. So Canada's chief science advisor, so it was big name people, they issue warnings about our approach. We were accused of experimenting, despite this being grounded in well-established immunologic and vaccine principles. However, more recently, there was a headline that said Canada's gamble, again, a negative word, paid off. So that we felt a little bit, had a little bit of retribution then. The core principles were scientific. The extended intervals were informed by the limited supply, early vaccine effectiveness, modeling, but most importantly, equity. We really felt it was important to allow vaccination of all with a single dose before vaccinating with a second dose. We subsequently moved from 16 weeks to 8 weeks as supply increased. And again, that 8 weeks is still not in alignment with the product monograph or how the product is authorized, but we were informed by studies and equity. So I just ended, although this is not necessarily focused on equity, I thought it was helpful to end on some reflections of vaccine guidance during emergencies. And the most important one is my first reflection. We need to do what's right, not what's easy. We need to actually have some thick skin here. Some populations have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. We need to recognize that in our guidelines. We need to continue acknowledging inequities and identify key populations at increased risk, even if it doesn't resonate with our general population. We need to be consistent and this is NACI specific, with our mandate and in alignment with our goals and the ethical principles that we upheld. We need to know what we know and be transparent about what we don't know. This pandemic has really emphasized that we need to make evidence and guidelines available in an accelerated rate when we don't have all of the information. We need to actually be very transparent about that. Words are important. We need to be clear. Think of the populations that we're targeting and ensure that we're sensitive in our words. And of course, the final one, there's no greater support than consultation. And although we didn't have the time to consult all of our stakeholder groups like we normally would have in a non-pandemic time, where typically a vaccine recommendation would take a year in developing, we modified our approach post-delivery of the recommendations in consultation with stakeholders. Sometimes that wasn't received well by the public because they felt we kept changing our recommendations, but we felt it was important to listen to our stakeholders and modify either if the information changes and we need to modify, or if things are not resonating well. So this is just a group of our membership. And I'd just like to thank you for having me. And I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A.
Hi all. So we thought what we would do is perhaps take one question. We do have a minute or two to take one clarifying question now before we have a discussion with the panel and anyone. So if anyone has a question, we invite you not to submit it virtually, because we're all here, to raise your hand and speak. Imagine. Are there mics? Okay. Okay, great.
Thank you very much for sharing that framework. Sorry. I'm wondering if you can speak to the differences between using the equity matrix with chronic health conditions and more acute health conditions, and if there are differences in how you use the framework to assess the equity issues. Thank you.
Yes, so for COVID, most of our, the use of the framework was for acute conditions. For HPV, for instance, we have used the framework, and that is more chronic disease. The prevention, the disease is a long, there's a long duration between vaccination and impact. And the identification of the priorities or of the factors to implement programs is different, and our ability to influence the outcome is different. So, you know, bringing it back to the scope of NACI, we make immunization recommendations. So we will make the recommendations for the chronic conditions. A lot of them are much broader than immunization. So we are less able to actually implement some of the solutions. So it is different, but but you know, our frame is actually not the long term. It is really the short term with the immunization recommendations. Now, we do share this with the provinces and territories and have conversations in the provinces and territories. And many of them, because they're responsible for health, have the ability to influence some of the recommendations in a way that is more holistic than only focusing on immunization. But some of the examples would include, like for COVID, recognizing that in some racialized groups, and particularly in new immigrant groups, they weren't necessarily comfortable coming to the pharmacy for vaccine delivery. We recommended mobile clinics to go to those sites. So although we recommended that at the NACI level, it was really up to the provinces and territories to determine how to actually action those recommendations. And some provinces did it to a better extent, I'll say frankly, than other provinces.
Mic to work. Very good. Yeah. Thank you so much, Shelley, for this first presentation in this meeting. Extremely informative, and we'll come back to it at the end. So just for everybody, as Tamara mentioned, we will have 1 or 2 clarifying questions after the presentations, and then a discussion at the very end. I'm extremely pleased to introduce now Dr. Vivian Welch. Vivian, if you want to go up. Yeah, an enormous pleasure. So Vivian is the editor-in-chief of the Campbell Collaboration and the acting CEO of Campbell, which obviously is a sister organization to GIN, a participant in the Global Evidence Summit that was held and hopefully will be held again. Vivian is also the director of the Method Center at Bruyère Research Institute, and she's an associate professor at Ottawa University, or University of Ottawa. Yeah, we've worked together too for many years, so it's an extreme pleasure to see you here, and another wonderful person who can tell us about or talk to us about equity and guidelines. Over to you.
Thank you. Okay. It's a great pleasure to be here, Holger, and thank you for the invitation. And thank you, Miloslav and Zach and Elaine, for this great conference, and all of you for coming. I want to take like 5 seconds of my presentation to say, as a Canadian, just thank you, Dr. Deeks, for everything you've done. Okay, yes, good. This way you won't have me running around trying to point at my slides. Okay, I'm very nervous. I was so happy to see Larry Frost with his feather and telling you that he was nervous. So, well, I'll just get into it. I don't have a feather, I just have my slides. So, yeah, how do I advance? Green button, the big one. Okay, so a few declarations of interest, just really my funding from Canadian Institutes of Health Research and others. My roles in Cochrane and Campbell probably color my views, and I don't have any other competing interests. I'd like to thank my research team and all my collaborators, a lot of you in this room, too many to name. Okay, so here's my feather. I'm going to introduce you to one of my passions in life, which is foraging for mushrooms. Those are the little pictures on the side, and I hope that I can make a link between foraging for mushrooms and looking for health equity evidence. Dr. Deeks probably has the most experience doing this. And I'll just talk a little bit about why we care about equity and guidelines. I don't think I have to convince you. A little bit about current status in terms of guidelines for how to do this and where we're at, and also touch on health equity and social sector guidelines and where next. Okay, so anybody know what this is? You can raise your hand. If you can read the tiny font, it's mycelium, which is what connects mushrooms under the ground, can run for hundreds of kilometers. and it's the fabric that connects not just mushrooms, but the whole ecosystem. And I never learned about this in science, but my 13-year-old is learning about it right now. And I think this is why we care about health equity. We're all connected, and Dr. Deeks made this abundantly clear. With COVID, we saw how inequities in vaccine distribution affect everyone. So if we go to the evidence ecosystem, this is a model of the ecosystem that was developed by Howard White, former CEO of Campbell and one of my mentors, so I have to use it, and I'm a fan. This shows, we have a lot of data, we have primary studies, but as you move up the pyramid, we're looking at increasingly curated forms of evidence that are, more helpful for decision makers. And guidelines and checklists are near the top of that pyramid. I think, and I hope I can convince you, that we actually want to see health equity at all levels of this pyramid. But as we do this in guidelines, we promote looking at equity throughout the evidence ecosystem. Okay, so this is a big challenge for you. Can you spot the mushrooms? So this is a field of black trumpet mushrooms. There's probably about 10 here. And people think they're hard to find, but as soon as you know what to look for, they're really easy. So I'm really nervous, but these little trumpet things, that's a mushroom. So you can see there's lots of them here once you know what to look for. Sorry for my hands. Okay, and so once you know what to look for, they're easy to find. And I think this is the case for health equity. Once you have a framework for what to look for, and I thought Dr. Deeks had the most beautiful explanation of how this was really operationalized in guideline panels using the Progress Plus framework. So I'm just going to show you how we've thought about it. So a lot of you in this room know that the evidence to decision tables came up with this question on equity in around 2014. It was a huge, huge advance in developing guidelines, in my biased view. And when this came out, people said, well, what am I going to do with this question? How am I going to answer this question? So how many people here have used this box? This is your audience participation moment. Okay, so like a few of you. Okay, we're going to have more of this. All right, so shortly after this, this equity question came out in the evidence to decision framework, a group of us met in Amsterdam to plan a series of papers about how to answer this question. And I always remember this meeting. I'm looking at Ellie because I know he was there. But I had to go to Montreal to catch a plane, and I followed my GPS, which took me to this horrifying thing, which is an ice bridge. Unfortunately, by the time I got there, I had to cross it or I would have missed my plane. So anyway, I don't recommend it, but it is safe. And you don't believe me. Right, so what we came up with at this planning meeting is that we want to think about equity throughout guideline development. So we want to think about it in the process, how we plan a guideline, who's involved in planning the guideline, whose priorities we address. We also want to think about it in evidence synthesis. So we rate certainty and we look at what is the evidence about specific populations, racialized populations who might be impacted differently by these guidelines. And lastly, we want to think about evidence to recommendation. So how does equity affect other aspects of the evidence to decision framework that we use, like acceptability, feasibility, resource use, and so on. And Ellie Ackle, Kevin Potty, I can't see Kevin, but he's here. So led some of these papers. Okay, so this is more audience participation. I'm warning you now. How many of you think that proportion of guideline authors is 50%? 50%? No? Nobody? Okay. 40%? No one still? Okay, 30%? All right, so quite a bit. 20%? Yeah, a few of you. Okay, so actually it's 16 to 40%, depends which guidelines, depends when you assess it. And one of these papers in a tiny font, Rye et al. Actually looks at the trend over time, so this has been increasing over time. Okay, more participation. Proportion of guideline panel members from racialized groups. How many people think 50%? Okay, so no one. How about 30%? A couple? 20? Okay, so you might have read the paper. So it is about 20%, and Holger was involved in this paper. So he knows the answer. You can follow him. So I do think this is a great baseline assessment. I mean, this is, good sign, I think. So I want to talk about evidence synthesis, and this is like my most geeky slide, because this is the paper that I led. So I want to think about the box in the evidence pyramid for guidelines, and what do we think about when we're thinking about evidence synthesis? So I think we think about representation. So who is in the studies that we're using to make these guidelines? So do we know what proportion of different populations is in the studies? And then how does that affect our certainty of evidence? And we want to be, and in our papers, we cautioned about being very careful downgrading evidence because people are not represented. You may actually deny effective treatment to those who could benefit the most. Okay, second thing, people always look for disaggregated analysis. I wish Gordon Guyatt was here, because I think this would be music to his ears, that I think this is maybe one of the most misleading things that we do in guideline assessment, because subgroup analysis, is rarely credible, has small numbers, is underpowered, and is really difficult to draw conclusions from. People still want to see it. So I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but I think you have to be really cautious about the conclusions you draw from it. And maybe the most useful thing about disaggregated analysis is that disaggregated data, if we move to a place where data is open and can be shared, people could use that to understand better where there are actual differences in effects. Okay, third thing I think we want to do in guidelines is contextualize the evidence for different settings and populations based on their experience and their event rate of the outcome. And the person who's done this the best that I know of is sitting in the back of this room, Carla Suarez-Weiser. And she led a Cochrane review 3 or 4 years ago on rotavirus vaccine, where their team decided to display separate summary findings tables for low resource settings, where with a higher prevalence of rotavirus, the vaccines, prevented more diarrhea, obviously. It was a great example. And the last thing I think, Dr. Deeks, you've explained so well is implementation challenges. And I tried to use a ladder because I think it's not just challenges, but also facilitators sometimes. And I think this is another way we think about equity. The one thing I think has been a real challenge in assessing the health equity box about likely increase or decrease is that people assess these two last things, contextualizing and implementation, in the same box, and they can go in different ways. So it can be really hard to decide which way. So I just want to give you a bit of a summary of how is equity being assessed now, how many guidelines are looking at equity. So this is work by Omar Duadar, who is also here. I don't know where he is in the room, but he has other presentations in the conference. This was an assessment of World Health Organization guidelines using the progress framework that Dr. Deeks explained, where almost half of guidelines mention health equity in one way or another, and about a quarter of them actually refer to these elements in the evidence to decision tables. Think about sex and gender. This is a paper looking at sex and gender in Canadian clinical practice guidelines. So about 2/3 mention sex or gender, but maybe only a third are reporting sex-specific diagnostic recommendations and so on. This is another example of racism and health inequities in U.S. Preventive Task Force that just came out recently. I think this is a really good sign. 19 out of 27 topics are addressing issues about race and ethnicity, mostly looking at prevalence and risk factors and how that contextualizes the evidence. Very few looking at uptake and implementation. Okay, so maybe you already recognize this is the same mushroom. It's called the black trumpet, or in Catalan, which is where my husband is from, it's called the trumpets of death. They're not deadly, they're absolutely delicious. So I hope you see these are the trumpets here and here, here. So in social sector guidelines, I think we're looking at the same thing when we're looking at equity, and hence I have the same mushroom. So we provide evidence in the Campbell collaboration on social science and social policy. We're actually, very few of our systematic reviews have been using guidelines, and as CEO, interim CEO of Campbell, I'd really like to see that change. So we're holding a small workshop tomorrow afternoon about developing non-health guidelines and what are the challenges. I just wanted to give an example that GRADE is actually being used in the social sector. This is a really fabulous example of a toolkit that uses GRADE principles of certainty of evidence for rating primary school education interventions. And the next step for this toolkit is actually really interesting. They've been challenged to assess equity. So they're going to start by looking at representation, whether these interventions have been used in schools in low socioeconomic neighborhoods, but then they also want to look at contextualizing. Okay, so I think I wanted to convince you that we're doing the same thing in social sector guidelines as in health guidelines. We're looking at process. Kevin Potty, who I can't find in the room, developed a series of guidelines for people who are homeless or vulnerably housed. And part of their process was to include a community of 5 community scholars with lived experience of homelessness. So they brought people with experience into the guideline process. In evidence synthesis, a colleague of mine, Leanne Zerda, is here and is working on guidelines on nutrition in the North, where they're bringing Indigenous knowledge with evidence synthesis together. So this is a new way of doing evidence synthesis. In evidence to recommendation, GRADE ETD tables are being used actually with very little adaptation for education guidelines, and Jerry Cantor will be talking about this tomorrow. So this is a new kind of mushroom. So where next? This is a mushroom called yellow feet. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of those. I've just found it this year, so it's a new thing for me. I took this photo right next to the ground so you could see the yellow feet, but from above they look like leaves, so I wish you luck, but they're quite delicious. So there's lots going on in equity. I think we're re-energizing the equity working group within GRADE. The one thing we'd like to do is update an extension for equity for the Gin McMaster checklist, and all are welcome. Secondly, the environment working group within GRADE is adapting equity to look at ethics, ethics and equity, so things like the polluter pays principle and whether that's included. And the GRADE education group I mentioned. So I think in summary, I hope you've discovered a love of mushrooms. And I think that we're on a path to health equity and guidelines that's quite optimistic, and I hope you'll all join that path. I think there still is a need for conceptual clarity about how we answer that health equity tick box, and ongoing work for applying equity. So with that, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you want to take this one?
Thank you so much for this very inspirational presentation. I learned something about mushrooms for sure, but I also learned a lot about health equity. I was wondering if there are any questions of clarification. Yeah, Rich, please. If there's a mic in the back. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you: would you cross? So Vivian is an avid cross-country skier. Would you cross that ice bridge on your skis? You should follow her on Strava, by the way. Anyways, yeah.
It's very thick. It's very safe.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Rich Rosenfeld from New York, work with the American Academy of Otolaryngology. So in the first presentation, pre-existing conditions were very briefly mentioned in the matrix, but your presentation really didn't mention that as part of these racialized groups. And my question is, how do you tease out the real issues that are related to a much higher prevalence of certain chronic diseases in these groups and bad lifestyle behaviors from the actual, genetic and other environmental things. And I work in Brooklyn where we have rampant diabesity. In certain populations, Hispanic youth, black youth, 75% of their diet now is ultra-processed junk food. Obesity is rampant among certain marginalized groups and racialized groups, as is type 2 diabetes. So I just wonder that we're really mixing and matching here and not teasing out the effect of these really important underlying conditions and lifestyle behaviors. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great question. Thank you. I think there's different views on this. So one view is that these lifestyle behaviors are a result of intergenerational and persistent inequities that makes choices difficult. And I think Sir Michael Marmot will be addressing that in his talk. So I think I'm probably going to defer to him. I do agree that pre-existing condition is really important. It's also really important when you think about who's in the studies, because the exclusion criteria often relates to multimorbidities, but that may actually be associated with racialized populations in some of these settings. So it's a really tricky way to separate those, but I think it's great. Thank you.
Thanks again. Thanks, Vivian. And we will have more time for discussion, as we indicated before. I'll hand it back over to Tamara.
Thanks, Holger. Thanks, Vivian. So it's now a great honor to welcome our guest online, and I do want to check that we are connected. Yeah, we've got a thumbs up. Is there more evidence? Okay, great. So a warm welcome to Sir Michael Marmot. Many of you will know the name from someone who's been leading the thought leader in the field of social determinants of health, a vastly experienced researcher, longitudinal studies, and a number of commissions and books related to social determinants of health. So Michael Marmot has been Professor of Epidemiology at University College London since 1985. And some particular books and pieces he's been involved in, such as the Commission on Equity and Health Inequalities in the Americas, that was set up in 2015. He also chaired the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, set up by the WHO in 2005, and has really set the playing field and challenged us with tough lines on how we consider the social determinants of health in what we do. And it brings me back to what Shelley said earlier, is do what's right and not what's easy, and we look forward to this talk from Sir Michael. Thanks very much.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to join you, albeit online. I want to put the question of decisions in the context of what actually determines health equity, which is largely the social determinants of health. The opening line of my book, The Health Gap, was why treat people and send them back to the conditions that made them sick. Particularly at the time of a pandemic, we think a great deal about the health care system. The chronic underfunding of the National Health Service in Britain is a national scandal. My focus, though, is on the conditions that make people sick, which is largely what's responsible for health equity. I'm going to use the example of the UK and more specifically England, not because I think you should all be interested in the UK. You were for 10 days of pomp and circumstance and queuing, but because we have good data and it illustrates the issue. In the wake of the WHO Global Commission, I was asked by the then Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, to answer the question, how could the findings and recommendations of the Global Commission apply to one country, England? And in 2010, I published the Marmot Review. February 2020, just before the pandemic crashed upon us, I look back at what had happened in the last 10 years to health equity, and to my recommendations. And the answer was, we lost a decade. Life expectancy had been improving about 1 year every 4 years for women and for men. And in 2010, there was a break in the curve. What happened in 2010? We had a new government elected, a Conservative-led coalition government. Possibly as a result of the policies of austerity of that government, we had a slowdown in health improvement. Then came the pandemic, and there was a dramatic reduction of at least 1 year in life expectancy. And 1 year is huge. If it had been improving 1 year every 4 years prior to 2010, we lost 4 years of improvement in a year of the pandemic. The government was a bit sensitive. You're not suggesting anything we did could have led to that slowdown. Maybe we've just reached peak life expectancy. So we looked at other countries. Annual life expectancy improvement in weeks: Estonia, Norway, Slovakia, Hungary, Denmark, Belgium, UK. We had the slowest improvement of any big country, rich country, except the USA. Iceland was in there too. So no, we had not reached peak life expectancy. And then there was inequalities. Each of these represents a region. This is women, the least deprived, the most deprived. Huge differences in life expectancy by level of deprivation. And you can see for the least deprived, life expectancy was improving a bit. And the regional differences were quite small. If you're rich, it doesn't much matter where in the country you live. If you're poor, it matters enormously. Much bigger regional differences. Life expectancy for the most deprived, 10%, was going up in London, but going down in virtually every region outside London. So this is where we were pre-pandemic 2020. Life expectancy had more or less stopped improving. Inequalities were getting bigger. And life expectancy for the poorest people was getting worse, was going down. This really is not supposed to happen, but it was happening. In my 2010 review, I had 6 domains of recommendations. Give every child the best start in life, education and lifelong learning, fair employment and good work for all. Number 4, highly relevant in a cost of living crisis, as we're all experiencing, ensure at least the minimum income necessary for a healthy life. Number 5, healthy and sustainable places and communities in which to live and work. And the 6th, taking a social determinants approach to prevention. The last question was asking about lifestyle. I asked, what are the social determinants of lifestyle? So, the government's ambition was to roll back the state. And by golly, they did it. Public sector expenditure in 2009-10 was 42% of GDP, and year on year it went down. So by the end of the decade, that 42% had become 35%, 36%. They rolled back the state. In my 2010 review, I coined the rather unfortunate phrase, proportionate universalism. The classic Anglo-Saxon approach to inequalities is you target the worst off. A more Nordic approach is you have universalist programs that apply to everybody. I was trying to combine them, so I said we should have universalist programs with effort proportionate to need. Here, for example, is the social distribution, let's say life expectancy. There's a social gradient. If you focus only on the poorest, you miss the health disadvantage of people further up the gradient. So we should have universalist policies with effort proportionate to need. What did we get post-2010? The grey bars are total local authority spending per person post-2010. This is for the least deprived quintile. The spending per person went down by 16%. And then the greater the deprivation, the greater the reduction in spending. For the most deprived quintile, it went down by 32%. What we've got here is effort inversely proportionate to need. The greater the deprivation, the greater the need. The greater the need, the greater the reduction in spending. Could this have played a role in the slowdown and improvement in life expectancy? The increase in inequalities? The decline in life expectancy in poorer areas? Yeah, I think it could. Remember, my first recommendation was give every child the best start in life. In the time available, I'm not going to go through all 6 of my recommendations, but let's take this one. Child poverty is defined as living in a household at less than 60% median income. Housing is a big contributor to poverty. Before housing costs, 17% of children were growing up in poverty in 2010-11. That's 27% after you've taken housing costs into account. Over the decade, the 27% became 30%. Child poverty went up. How was that achieved? If we look at the changes the Minister of Finance, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, made to household income based on his tax and benefit reforms by income. The red is working age families with children. If you were in the poorest income decile, your income would have gone down by 20% as a result of changes the Minister of Finance made to the tax and benefit system. If you were in the second poorest decile, your income would have gone down by 12%. And then the richer you were, the less the reduction. A bit of reduction at the top, but nowhere near as big as the reduction at the bottom. The new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, said, all that focus on inequality over the last while, I'm not going to focus on inequality anymore. I'm just going to go for prosperity. If the rich get richer, that'll be good for everybody. What? We already had government policy which was to make the poor poorer. And it doesn't have to be like that. 41 rich countries, Iceland, Czech, Denmark, Finland, child poverty 10-11%, the average is 20%, a slightly different way of calculating it. The UK ranks 31st out of 41 countries. The US ranks 38th out of 41 countries. Before redistribution, using the fiscal system, Finland's child poverty is higher than the US. They don't like to have children growing up in poverty in Finland, so they use the fiscal system, tax dollars, to reduce child poverty, as they do in Denmark, the Czech Republic, Iceland, Korea. It's discretionary. It's a political choice. Public spending on early child education and care, fundamental to children's development, going on to better schooling, going on to better qualifications, higher income, better jobs, better living conditions, and better health. Norway spends about $12,000 per child per year, child age 0 to 5. The OECD average is around $6,000. The UK spends $4,000. Not the worst, but limping along below the average. And I ask the new Prime Minister who wants to cut taxes, do you want us to be even worse? Do you want us to look like the United States? We looked at all the other domains, and we had ample explanation for the slowdown. And then, of course, came the pandemic. And we said from the beginning, the pandemic would expose the underlying inequalities in society and amplify them. And so it proved. There's the social gradient in mortality from all causes by level of deprivation, and there's the social gradient in the mortality from COVID-19. It looks almost exactly parallel to the gradient from all causes. Yes, there's a lot of discussion about exposure to the virus, adequacy of immunization, and the like. But we've got to deal with the underlying inequalities. Some excess here in the most deprived, having to work in frontline occupations, living in overcrowded households, but we need to deal with the inequalities. I showed you the 1-year drop in life expectancy. In fact, the UK did very poorly in handling the pandemic, as did the United States. And I asked myself, what's the link? So pre-pandemic, life expectancy was stalling, inequalities were increasing, life expectancy for the poorest people was falling, and that slowdown in life expectancy was nearly the slowest of all rich countries, except the US. And the pandemic, in the first wave, in the UK, we had the highest excess mortality. And over the 2 years, we had the biggest fall in life expectancy, except for the United States. And I think the link between these two, pre-pandemic poor health and poor management of the pandemic, is poor governance and political culture, increasing social and economic inequalities, the reduction in spending on public services. We were ill-prepared and we were unhealthy. I'm going to say just a little bit about healthcare. This is the social determinants of health. But the social prescribing movement is actually saying that general practitioners, primary care doctors, can actually make a difference by addressing people's needs. Local non-clinical services. And when I spent a year as president of the World Medical Association, we produced a report on Doctors for Health Equity. And we said there are 5 things that medical profession and health professions more generally could do. Workforce education and training, seeing the patient in broader perspective, health sector as employer, but I would now generalize that and say the health care as anchor institution, working in partnership, and the workforce as advocates. So we've had a big challenge to health equity, a decade of austerity, another big challenge, the pandemic, and now this third challenge, the cost of living crisis. Already, before cost of living, you talk about lifestyle. If people wanted to follow the healthy eating guidance, those in the bottom 10% of household income would have to spend 74% of their income on food to eat healthily. Some of our politicians say, well, poor people are too stupid or too ignorant or too lazy. They're not. Don't blame poor people. Blame their poverty for diet. And food insecurity went up dramatically during the pandemic. Between October 2021 and April 2022, there was a 59%, 60% rise in food insecurity. And 1 in 7 households is now food insecure. With the cost of energy, a fuel poverty crisis facing us, the safety net is now going to be food banks. Meanwhile, food and energy billionaires are $453 billion richer than they were 2 years ago. We are working with integrated care systems. Lancashire and South Cumbria Health and Care Partnership, Cheshire and Merseyside, the East London NHS Foundation Trust. They've asked us to advise them on how they could address social determinants of health. And at the moment, working with the national government has been dispiriting. They're headed off in a totally different direction. But I'm not dispirited. We've been working with localities. Coventry declared itself as the first Marmot city. Greater Manchester said, if Coventry can do it, we'll be a Marmot city region. Luton declared itself as the first Marmot town. Waltham Forest, Cheshire, Merseyside, Lancashire and Leeds, Gwent wants to be the first Marmot region in Wales. So Coventry, Marmot city, took my 6 domains of recommendations and built their planning for the whole city, not just the healthcare system, but their city planning around these 6 domains. We did a report for Greater Manchester, Build Back Fairer in Greater Manchester, Health Equity and Dignified Lives. In Cheshire and Merseyside, Altogether Fairer, Health Equity and the Social Determinants of Health. It's the integrated care system, but local government, the voluntary community and faith sector. And now business, Legal & General, a big financial institution and insurance company. They have £2 trillion under investment, approached me and said, could we use our investments to improve health and health equity? We produced a report, The Business of Health Equity, the Marmot Review for Industry. We said 3 domains: good quality work, pay, conditions. So help your employees have flourishing lives. Goods and services. In public health, we have tended to keep industry at arm's length for good reasons, alcohol, tobacco, and so on. And we said, you've got to think about products and services and how they impact on the health of clients and customers, and then the wider impact on communities and the environment. So, going forward, I have my 6 domains of recommendations: give every child the best start in life, education and lifelong learning, fair employment and good work for all, having enough money to live on, healthy and sustainable places and communities, and taking a social determinants approach to prevention. In the light of COVID, we've added a 7th, tackle racism, discrimination, and their outcomes. And this should have been here all along. Pursue environmental sustainability and health equity together. I was asked by a journalist 2 days after Liz Truss became Prime Minister, if you were invited to Downing Street, what would you say to the Prime Minister? I would say, in addition to addressing those 8, pay attention to poor governance and political culture, to the increasing social and economic inequalities, reverse the reduction in spending on public services. Improving the health of the population has to be a priority, and put a fair distribution of health and well-being at the heart of all government policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Michael. At this point, we'd like to just open up and see if we have any specific questions of clarification, specifically for Sir Michael. Just looking for any hands. Okay. Then I think we can proceed with questions and open up for general discussion for the panel from us. And I guess maybe I can start off. Last week I was chatting to someone, and they said in their community, they were in a cafe where what we would call a corner store kind of thing, and a woman was saying, should I buy bread or should I buy electricity? And that is in South Africa, which is a relatively rich country. But we feel and see the inequity very, very broadly. And I just wonder, speaking to the panel here, how can we as guideline developers, how do we incorporate, so we have equity as a part of our decision framework, But how do we perhaps incorporate some of the more the principles that Sir Michael raised with us? How do we get more active in engaging our guideline panels who really still struggle a bit with this concept of equity and how to break it down? So I don't know if you have any ideas or anything you can add for us. How did you tackle it?
I'm happy to start. I don't think we actually are incorporating equity in, well, I can speak from the immunization perspective. I don't think holistically around the world we are incorporating equity into our guidelines. So I still think that there is a long way to go to incorporate systematically equity in immunization guidelines. I also think that we need to have some accountability in terms of decision makers, because it is the policymakers that need to implement the guideline. And if there's no accountability for implementing equitable guidelines, they may not actually get implemented, and of course we need everything implemented. And then stepping back, what has been frustrating for me in the pandemic is we have looked in silos for in our immunization recommendations within country, and there was no incentive to have a global equity approach in guidelines, despite SAGE recommendations. And I'm hoping coming out of this pandemic, there is a call to ensure that in the next pandemic, we are not so focused downward within country, but are held to account to focus globally to assist with equity.
Could I
Sure.
add a word?
Of course.
I think thinking about the health care system, there's two general approaches. One is a bit like I would have said in the very unlikely possibility the Prime Minister would have asked me to advise her on her third day in office. Put equity at the heart of all decision making. Now, I was saying that to government, but I'd say that to decision makers within the health care system. Look at all your decision making. For example, I had in the past a debate with a Minister of Health, in fact in Ireland, and she said she wanted the biggest return on funding. She wanted the most efficient use of money. And I said, well then forget equity. If you want efficiency, invest all your money in middle class areas. You'll get the best return. It's very inefficient to be equitable. She looked horrified and said, but that's not what I came into politics to do. Yes, so have an equity principle, not just an efficiency principle. Very important. And the second approach is, when I listed 5 things that healthcare people can do, the 5th was advocacy. If children can't eat because of poverty in a rich country, then the medical profession has a responsibility. 2 days ago, there's the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges in the UK, so all the specialty Royal Colleges, physician, surgeon, pediatrics, and so on. And they asked me to come and talk to their annual meeting on health inequalities. And I said, you're very important people. If you stand up from a health point of view, not from a left wing, right wing, some other wing political point of view, but from a health point of view, to talk about the cost of living crisis, to talk about child poverty, why we need to improve living and working conditions from the point of view of people's health, and equity should be at the center of that discussion.
Thank you. We have, yeah. Thanks so much. We have one question from the floor, and then maybe.
Yeah, Benjamin Beggars, City Hall, California.
If you could, sorry, Ben, if you could say your name again and where.
Yeah, Benjamin Beggars from City Hall, California, U.S. Just following up on the issue of using equity in guidelines, and to Dr. Deeks and your really fantastic presentation and how you struggled. And I'd like to really talk a little, if you can, give us a little bit more information how you went about extending to this 8 weeks dosage instead of 2 weeks, because obviously you just illustrated that equity was used to make a recommendation. Presumably it was a strong recommendation that everybody gets vaccinated. So in a way you actually, and I wonder basically how you, I would like to hear actually how you went about that. So the highly efficacious vaccine works for everyone, 95% whatever, but then obviously you couldn't give it to everyone. So you used what I presume surrogate data, laboratory data, indirectness, and basically to use lingo of evidence-based medicine and GRADE in order really to extend that access to everyone. But obviously you were facing now, look, I know I can save some lives, and maybe, if I'm wrong, using surrogate markers, I'm giving worthless stuff to everyone. So equity obviously was judged as more important, and in the end you got it right. So how you went about this, because that's basically what it is. And I think we're going to see more and more these kind of issues. We will actually have to make decisions based on indirectness in order to heed to the things that we value, which is equity. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. When we first used the 16-week interval, it was highly debated at the committee level, and we looked at immunologic principles and other vaccine programs. Typically, when you have a primary series, vaccines aren't licensed with a 3-month, let's use Pfizer for example, with a 3-month interval. Typically, primary series do have a 1-month or a 2-month interval between doses. And you need to remember that the vaccine companies and the clinical trials were also under immense pressure to get products licensed. And so the interval that was studied and approved was a very short interval. We looked at data after first dose and which when we looked at the curves, we saw that there was immunogenicity after the first dose. And then we looked at immunologic principles and considered equity and how fast in the Canadian context we could get first dose out to the populations that wanted, and that's why initially we used 16 weeks. Then as supply became an issue, less of an issue, we rolled it back, and at that point in time there was vaccine effectiveness data, so we could ground it in vaccine effectiveness data from the UK and Canada. We couldn't ground it from data from the US or Israel because they stuck to the short interval. And that's when we took it to 8 weeks, and all of our subsequent vaccine recommendations, including the child, the under 5s and the 5 to 11, were 8 weeks, despite the authorization at 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah, Vivian, please go ahead. Yeah, I was just going to, well, I think pick up on this issue and from the previous question that, Tamara, your question about equity, how does it fit in the guideline panel when you're deciding between food and energy? I think it's part of the process that I talked about, that it's part of the principles or the values of the guideline panel, putting equity, as Dr. Deeks Nasi did, and as Sir Michael, you're advocating in all policies. I think it's part of where do we step it back so it's right at the start of guideline development, whose priorities and what are the principles.
Thanks, Vivian. I have more questions for you, but I'll come back to that. We have questions from the audience. Go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Martin Scherer. I'm currently president of the German College of General Practitioners, and I want to ask Sir Michael or to help me in order to prioritize the key messages. So what do you think from a GP point of view or from a GP college point of view is most important to move forward and to promote social prescribing? Or second, to have a loud voice and to encourage and to go to the politics and tell them to do their job and to work for equity. So what is most important from a GP point of view in your opinion?
I don't think it's an either-or. For an individual GP, I think social prescribing is something that you can do. I mentioned the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, and I was in fact talking to the head of the Social Prescribing Institute College in the UK, and she said they're really taking off. They're really taking off. It's not now just one practice in East London. It's taking off all around the country, and there's an international movement. So I would say social prescribing, number one, start tomorrow and try and get GPs in your country all doing it. The second, about advocacy, it's much stronger if it's done collectively. Individual voices are important, but they're not enough. And it means that the doctors' organization, whether it's locally, whether it's at the land level, or whether it's federally, the organization's voice really counts. So my response is, you as an individual GP, start social prescribing tomorrow. But your collective of doctors' voices needs to be heard, and heard from the health viewpoint. My approach to all of this, I'm no economist, I'm no social policy person. The reason you should listen to us is because we are concerned with health and health equity.
Thank you for that as well. I will follow up with one question. My name is Holger Schünmann. I'm the co-chair for the scientific session. You cannot see us, I believe, at least not well. So thanks very much. Your 8 principles, would you say that they are global principles? You said in your introduction that you were referring to the UK, but are those global principles?
Oh, absolutely. We derived them initially from the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health, and then applied them to the UK. But we had very similar principles. I did, as you heard in the introduction, I did a commission in the Americas, I chaired a commission for Europe, and most recently one for North Africa and the Middle East. And the details, the nature of how you apply them differ a little bit from country to country. In the Middle East, North Africa and the Middle East, we're very concerned with conflict and with religion, faith-based organizations for obvious reason. But those principles, I think, are very generally applicable. They're not for the UK alone, by no means.
No, thank you, because then to create the bridge to our guideline world, I would say that those are, because they were all actionable statements, the way that you've described them, and they are, I would put forward some, in the guideline context, these are good practice statements, best practice statements. They cannot be really argued with. And we should come back to that through the conference, I believe, because it is obviously central to equity. There are 2 questions from the floor. I think you were first, and then Carla.
Thank you. Hello again. My name is John Heald. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself earlier. I run the guidelines program at a Medical Specialty Society in the States, the Infectious Diseases Society of America. So my question is for the panel, all of you as leaders of organizations, because I care about equity and efficiency, both, not or. And so my question is, as an organization, what are the capabilities that we need to build or to create so that we can balance both equity and efficiency as we develop guidelines?
Thanks.
Well, could I just start with the very first thing you need is data. When you asked me, are these principles potentially global? Absolutely, I said. But the problem is, in very few countries outside Europe, North America, Australasia, do we have the data on social determinants of health. In most countries, we don't even have the data on health inequities in adults. We do have some data from demographic and health surveys on infant and child inequalities in mortality, but we don't even have data on adult inequalities or inequities in health. So number one is to have the data, have good data systems so you know what you're doing. Is there a trade-off between equity and efficiency? How do we know if we haven't got the data, if we haven't got the evidence? So the number one principle is improving the quality of information.
That's a great point. I see we have two more questions. I think we can take both of the questions and then give an opportunity for any of the panel members to respond as we close the session. So Carla.
Thank you. Carla Soares-Weiser, Editor-in-Chief for Cochrane. I want to refer to some of the things that Vivian mentioned about having everyone at the table for equity. And I want actually to give the example of the systematic review that Vivian mentioned that was unfortunately not 3 years, but 20 years and 12 updates. And one of the key points on that systematic review for rotavirus vaccine was me to be invited to present the results of my first review to Ministry of Health of Africa at the WHO. And when I started presenting, after 5 minutes, everybody was sleeping. And I thought, something is wrong. And I actually stopped the presentation and asked them, what's wrong? So they said to me, you're a good researcher, we know that. We believe in what you're doing, but you're not asking the right questions. We don't want to. We know, the questions that you're presenting to us. What we want to know is in a setting where we don't have access to people, when we need to travel 24 hours, if we can extend the time between one dose and the second dose, or if we can give it outside the window that is preconized by the WHO, etc., etc. And that's when our review was changed and became much more useful to make decisions. So I think it's very important for us to consider to put everyone in the table as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Carla.
Thank you. I'm Ezio Távora from Brazil, from the Brazilian TB Researchers Network and from the WHO CSTF. Thank you for the great presentations, and thanks, Professor Marmot, for the brilliant, exciting session. I have more of a comment because actually one of the panelists have already responded. What would be my question is that there is not a consultation properly being done for the most affected. So that's basically my point. How do we develop guidelines without consulting those who are most vulnerable for those aspects? How can we continue building guidelines without listening to how this affects the lives of people affected? So my question would be, like, how to guarantee that in the process of guideline development we include consistently people affected and people most vulnerable to guarantee not only the accuracy of data, but also the opinion how does the guideline will be applied. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ezio. Thank you, Carla. I think we're on the hour now, and it is time to wrap up. I think there are more questions than answers as ever. I do want to thank the panel very much. I think we could carry on talking forever, and so a big thank you to Sir Michael, to Vivian, to Dr. Deeks for sharing their experiences and views, and thanks to all of you for being here.
So, this is the end of this session. Just to be on time, again, many thanks to everybody for joining us in Toronto. Next sessions are in your program, obviously, and enjoy the conference.